It was, yeah.
Matagalata.
Yep.
Right.
So I think we're live. Hi, my name is
Yeah.
Subodh, and it's my pleasure to be in conversation with three wonderful writers, Jane Borges, Himanjali, Sankar, and Saikat Majumdar, uh, for this session of the winter retreat by tellmeyoursstory.biz. We're going to spend the next 45 minutes talking about atmospheric fiction, the where, why, and how to set stories. So, we had a short sort of chat, the four of us, before the session, and we thought we'd broadly break it into four parts. So let's jump straight into the first part, where let's examine, your works. Jane's just as you, most of you on this probably know, her first work of fiction has just come out. So Bombay Balchao. So Jane, may I ask you to start about, Bombay Balchao and your work, and how did you set about creating that wonderful atmosphere that we all so love?
Um, Hello, Subodh. And firstly, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be part of this panel. I'm meeting all of you for the first time. And diving right into your questions, Subodh. I've written two books. The first book that I wrote was nonfiction, and it was set in Mumbai. It was about the female gangsters of Mumbai. And at that
Correct.
point, I was exploring the space that I was covering was, the dark, gritty underbelly side of Mumbai. With
That's the
Bombay
one you wrote in
Balchao,
collaboration with Hussein Zaidi, right?
yes, I co-authored with Hussein Zaidi for that particular one.
Right.
And Bombay Balchao again had a very urban Bombay setting. The only difference being that this was a completely different space. While it was in the city, it was completely isolated from the city in a way that it was cloistered. They were living in, um, I think, oblivion about what was happening around the city. And we have so many such spaces within Mumbai, which we call Gauthans or village pockets, which have remained unchanged over, centuries. Even the residents, the way they live, the culture, the community life hasn't been affected by the change or development that's taking place in Mumbai. I come from a space like that, and I think Bombay Balchao stemmed from this urgency to tell a story about spaces like mine, Cavell, which are fast vanishing, probably because no matter how closed you are to change, things eventually dismantle and break apart, and that's what's happening with Cavell. And it was out of this very sense of wanting to um, tell the story of people who you don't think, because in the last 15 years I've seen things change very rapidly in Cavell, and I thought, maybe this is the time that I talk about it. And while I'm a journalist, it's sometimes very hard to tell stories like this very objectively. There was a deliberate attempt at wanting people to fall in love with spaces like Cavell, and which is why I turned to fiction to tell the same story.
Superb. And from that, I'm gonna ask you, Himanjali, because
Yeah.
you've written very, very serious works of fiction for adults, and on the other hand, you've written these wonderfully engaging stories for children. So, in terms of atmosphere, we're talking North and South poles.
Yeah.
Should we dive a little bit into that and talk about?
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, I was also, since we're talking about atmosphere, I was trying to think of my process of writing. So, generally, when I'm planning a book, what comes to me first is possibly the story, the characters, and the atmosphere is. It's sort of, if I'm taking it as a separate element from the story and characters, it's dictated by the story, by the characters. So, and I think in my head, I have a clear idea of location, of
where I'm putting my story. And say sometimes it would be a setting which is familiar to readers. So I need to elaborate on the setting minimally. There can be little hints or clues, but the reader would get it instinctively. So since you were talking about I was just thinking of my children's books where there is a time-telling super dog. So, but the super dog is based on my dog, and so the setting is real. I mean, it's a realistic setting, though the dog, of course, knows how to tell the time. So when I was writing it, I think what I was visualizing was. I was my own apartment where I was living at that point. So it was the neighborhood that I lived in then. I was in Vasant Kunj at that time. So I knew if I just, so through the story, you know the kind of family the dog belongs to. And from that, the reader very naturally, instinctively gets a sense of the atmosphere or rather the setting. So, but in this book also there were the orange marmalades, which are like, of course, that's a more fantastical element. And the orange, so the orange marmalades come from Marmaland, which is supposed to be a land outside of Earth. So in that case, I think I had a lot of fun creating that land, and I kind of I describe it, and it's sort of because it's not something that's going to be familiar for readers, so the reader has to I need to provide more detail over there so they can the reader can get it. So
you actually played Marmaland quite a bit.
Yeah, I did. It was great fun. Yeah. So, but when it comes to adult fiction, again, like you said, that's a more serious space. And I have to say, I'm also personally not very comfortable with doing very descriptive prose. I think I do characters more and dialogue more better. So and especially when it comes to prose, what I feel is that it's just giving an example. So when I want to show it's evening, I can mention that the sun is setting, but I imagine that the reader has seen the sun setting and how beautiful that can be. So it's not like I need to mediate that experience that the reader has of a sunset with my words, because I feel like it's something that the reader already has their own understanding of a sunset. So what I hesitate is to unless I have something meaningful to add to it, or some new way of saying it, or just something new, fresh, then I would kind of go into that description more. But mainly I find, because especially because we're talking about this, it struck me that I'm not really the sort of writer who is very descriptive when it comes to the kind of writing I do.
And that is something that I'm going to sort of observe on before I jump on and ask Saikat the same question. I've had the privilege of reading all three of your work, right? James Bombay Balchao is very vivid in its description of the settings and food, whereas with The Lies We Tell or with even Mrs. C, you're far more about the characters and what they do in your storytelling, and a little less about the atmosphere, though it does come through very clearly. And Saikat, I would say, whether it was Firebird or Silverfish, or even The Scent of God, I thought was somewhere in between. Saikat, can we talk about, at your works of fiction, the three works of fiction, and about the atmospheres that you've so lovingly created in those?
Sure, thank you. It's a great subject. I have to say this is a subject that's very close to my heart, because what I always tell my students is that literature is the most abstract of all art forms. You see, it's not like painting or film or music, which actually appeals to the senses directly. Literature works through language, which you think about it is a completely artificial medium. And yet the miracle is that with language, we can create a very sensory world. So I've always been drawn as a reader, to works which create this very sensory world through a very abstract medium. And the beauty of that is, of course, everybody thinks, even if you describe a road, everybody will imagine it slightly differently. It's a very important subject. And for me, as Subodh very kindly pointed out, they've been very important to all my work. My very first novel, Silverfish, was set in Calcutta, and yet that feels very much like a first novel. I'm probably the most lukewarm about of all my novels, that's the one I'm least enthusiastic about, because I felt in many ways my evocation of the city was very anthropological. And when you write about a city like Calcutta, there's this huge tradition of so much literature, not just in English but in Bangla. And I think I was being a little derivative there. It was only with my second novel, published 8 years later, The Firebird, where I felt I really found my voice as a novelist. And it's a story of a young boy and his relationship with his mother, who's a theater actress, and the trouble he has dealing with this, to see her on stage playing a different role, whether she's in a sexual relationship with somebody or just in a kind of playing a different life where he's not a part of. It's very difficult for him to accept it, and what the prejudices are of society about women who act. And obviously this would be impossible without plays, because for one thing I had to evoke the intimacy of the theater space. For any of you who've been involved in theater or like plays, it's a very intimate and a very powerful space. Not just the experience of watching theater is a kind of a communal experience. That's where it's different from film, because there's a flesh and blood reality. The people there are there. You can almost breathe them depending where you're sitting. And it's not just that. If you're involved in theater, and this partly comes from my own personal memory, because even though the story is invented, my mother was a theater actress. She passed away when I was fairly young. But this whole sense of watching a play from the wings, or from the darkness of or going to a green room. So this very visceral, very sensory kind of an atmosphere, but the senses come up. Stories are made and unmade. You create stories and you see the backside of the sort of back alleys of stories. And then, of course, this all happened within, 80s Calcutta, which was a very strange time, because it's a kind of very decadent communist rule, which were promoting a certain kind of experimental theater. But there was also an older kind of theater known as commercial theater, which had very close links with the red light district of the city. So very close links with, prostitutes. And there was a kind of a decadent entertainment. So it would be impossible. It would be impossible without. In many ways, I think the story of The Firebird is a kind of a universal story, the stigma attached to performers, especially women in performances. And at the same time, it's all universal stories have a local manifestation. How it actually was created in that location, how these prejudices against female actors, how they were kind of imagined in middle class society of a certain time in Calcutta. So place was actually not just a setting, place was a character. Place was what created the values, it created the sensibility. So, something like, I use the word para there, I use the word para, that the kind of gossipy, I was just thinking of actually one moment from Jane's stories, where I think the Hindu women were looking at the Catholic women, and there's a sense of prejudice. And this is exactly, that's why I really enjoyed the stories, because this is exactly the kind of prejudice I talk about in my novel, that this sense of gossip. And for me, the word para, the Bengali word para, was necessary to capture it. Neighborhood didn't capture it. So this was very important in my most recent novel, which Himanjali has published actually, under her. It was not just a city, but it was a very new kind of a place, a boarding school run by a Hindu monastic order, and it created its own universe. Sometimes, there are certain places, especially boarding schools and hostels, which become kind of an enclosed space, which become its own universe. And what fascinated me is the strange play of the religious and the erotic. It's a place where sort of the boys are given a kind of a religious training, and yet they come into puberty. So how do you say no to the body? How do you abstain? Because abstinence is the order of the order of the day here. And yet, how do you abstain when your body speaks differently? So this strange intersection of the religious and the erotic, and the kind of a sensory nature of saffron. Saffron, Hinduism is such a sensory religion. The kind of the incense, the hymns, the tat, the puja, and all of that creates a certain eroticized atmosphere. So for me, it was kind of a unique space. And yet the city also plays a role here, the world outside, the very gritty, dusty city. So for me, and in many ways, the protagonist is pushed to be making a choice. You live a life in the city, in the street, or you live in this idyllic pastoral world where a certain alternative kind of sexuality is suddenly made possible, is accommodated. So for me, I think it's impossible to actually imagine a story or a character without without a setting. I mean, I think I moved beyond this setting in my new novel, which also Himanjali will publish later this year. It's a super novel which travels between the US and Delhi and many different locations. But for me, the sensory evocation of space and this marvel that is literature, that is that which creates to life neither by painting, nor by sound, nor by the multiplicity of the cinema. How merely through some black science, this arbitrary thing called language, we can actually create worlds. And the best part is the world always means something different to the reader. The reader, even if you describe the color blue is never the same to every reader who reads it. Everybody has a different notion of blue. So imagine how complex sensations could look like grief, fantasy, despair. It means so many different things. So this evocation of the sensory, I think, is extremely essential for me as a writer. Thank you.
Amazing. Just taking off from what you just talked about so lovely, so beautifully, is about the atmosphere being a sort of a sensory thing, right? And which kind of brings me to the next question. So when you talk about the sensory thing of everything sort of coming together, the way you so almost tease the reader into creating these worlds in their own head. But the commonality that I saw between what James talked about and what Himanjali talked about and you talked about is the strong connection to what I call home, right? Where you yourself belong. I'm sure that Calcutta has strong sort of cultural connects, but you live in, Delhi, both for you and Himanjali. Jane, I think you talked about home being this little part of Mumbai, which is a village in itself, but you now live in the big city, Mumbai. But home, I think, is such a strong sort of, I would almost say it's like roosting pigeons. We all go back to home, or what we consider home. And that becomes such an important aspect in all of these works that you create. The smells, the senses, the scents. Himanjali, whether you're writing Mrs. T or whether you're writing about, the talking dog, home played such a very, very important role in that. Could you kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah, I was actually just okay. So I grew up in Calcutta first, say 22 years of my life, and then I've been in Delhi ever since. So I've been in Delhi as much as I've been in Calcutta, more in fact by now. So, but yeah, you're right that when especially I'm not really comfortable locating my stories in an unfamiliar space. So I am in my head. I might not even mention the name of the city. It's not, I mean, in some books I have, in some I haven't. But in my head, it's always either Calcutta or Delhi. And there'll be scenes there might be scenes occasionally which is outside of these two places, but primarily it is Calcutta or Delhi for me. And I was just thinking about say one of my books, which is talking of Muskan, where I drew a lot from my own childhood. So that book in my head, I mean, I don't think I mentioned Calcutta at all, but when whatever I was visualizing, that was very strongly Calcutta for me. And The Lies We Tell, which is in a similar young adult space, but Lies We Tell doesn't have too much of a connect with my childhood. Because I've actually taken more from my older daughter, her snippets of what was happening in her life, her friends' lives. So when I was visualizing that book, it was Delhi. Delhi was what was there in my head, and that was my home then. And with Mrs. C, of course, it goes back and forth, Delhi and Calcutta. So yeah, it's kind of almost predictably my two homes are there in all my writing. And in fact, I remember in Super Dog when I was writing it, there is one scene which is located in London because uh, even my editors we had this discussion and we thought it would be good fun to bring in the Big Ben because it was sort of as a plot element because that was like a big symbol of time. And I remember, I've been to London only once, and for me it was unfamiliar territory and it was really uncomfortable. I kept looking out the place and looking at photographs because it's not like I had to use all those details, but I just need to know the space which I'm writing about. So yeah, I guess that's how. So I guess maybe I'm a little safe when it comes to my writing, so I don't really want to go very far from what I know. But yeah, I think if I were to try a new genre, say if I'm trying to write something like crime or horror, which is essentially the atmosphere, it would be something different. Which would like you would need to do something different, and that would be challenging and interesting. And I think that then the idea of home, I don't know whether that would come in at all, or you would move away from that. Yeah.
True, so true, and I think that was also, I might not have been, entirely. This was part of what I was looking for, but I also wanted to, question, and maybe Saikat, you can take a shot at this. A question about how home and what you feel sort of instinctively and deeply about eventually finds its way into the writing, right? And becomes such a very strong influencer in what you set out to create. And when you talked about the Calcutta theater and then this really beautiful metaphor of watching from the wings, and your mother being in theater, I'm sure some of that came from home. I'm sure the wings were your little home when you were a young child watching your mother, perform.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. That's very well put, Subodh. Thank you. I think the home is a very important thing for writers, probably because it tends to be so elusive. Especially those of us who write in English and who've lived in many different places. We are always looking for home because in many ways it's never there. And like Himanjali, I also spent the first my childhood and early youth in Calcutta, and then I lived away. I lived away actually in the US for many years, and then I returned to India, living in Delhi for the last 4 years. So for me, Calcutta is not just a place but also a phase. And this is a conversation I had with this the American novelist, faming young Vietnamese American novelist when I was teaching in the US. And she said something very interesting. She said, "You see, the first 5 years is all you need when you write fiction." And I said, "What do you mean, the first 5 years?" And she said, "The first 5 years gives you the material for a whole lifetime of fiction. That's all." And I'm like, wow, that's so interesting. This is kind of when I was thinking of the Firebird. And then I realized that there's something very powerful about childhood and early youth. Maybe say up to the age of 18, because that's the time when you have a lot of experiences which you don't really understand. You after that, of course, you still may have experiences you don't understand, but when you're a child you may have fears, like again this fear of sort of this sense of watching my mother playing a role on stage and yet not quite understanding that she was dying on stage. And I remember a moment, if you might remember this from the Firebird, that the child is terrified that the mother is dying. And this was a real moment that I'm thinking like, oh, my mother is really dying. And this fear was the seed of the novel, that, oh, I'm losing my mother. So I think that's a very powerful thing for fiction, to be hit by experience and yet not being able to make sense of it. This gulf between experience and understanding is a gray zone.
Is that I think we might have lost Saikat. So Jane, let's, just in the interest of time, let's jump in, right? To me, one of the most beautiful things that I connected with in Bombay Bal Chao was the way you so lovingly described Cavell. Everything about it, right? And I have never been, but I can imagine it now. Uh, so more than Mumbai, I tend to believe that Cavell is where home is. So could you talk about that and that really powerful influence that you've tried to bring across in your writing?
Subodh, I find it very interesting, even when Himanjali and Saikat mentioned their childhood and how that created strong impressions in them. Strangely, I grew up in Muscat, which is a city in Oman in the Gulf. And I came back when I was about 15 or 16, and my parents had bought property in Cavell. Um, and I moved to this place. So I grew up in a very cosmopolitan environment where our neighbors were Filipinos, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis. They were from across the world. And suddenly I come into this environment where my neighbor is Catholic, where conversations revolve around religion, around church, around parish feasts, about when you're going to mass, when is Christmas, or when is the next celebration that's happening. For me, it was a very different kind of setting for a child, having come from an environment where church was not such an important part of um, their way of life, and then suddenly being put into this community where everyone is watching how you work or negotiate your way in a very Christian environment was very amusing. I didn't really take to Cavell very easily and not so quickly, I would say. I think I actually, after I completed Mafia Queens of Mumbai, I decided I wanted to leave Bombay for a while, or Mumbai, because um, I just needed to find myself. For me, home was still Muscat, home was still Oman, because I grew up there. Um, when I went back to Oman, so I left my job at the Asian Age and I went back to Oman and worked there for 2 years. And suddenly there was this, I don't know what happened. I became so heavily nostalgic about home. And I started at that point, I was, because I did not know how to connect with home, I started writing these random stories about places that I loved in Mumbai. And all those stories in some way led me to Cavell, and that is actually the genesis of the book. It emerged from an exploration of home, a desire to be back home. Suddenly I realized that home was Cavell and not Muscat, where I had brought myself. I came back 2 years later and went on to complete Bombay Balchao. But again, I was exploring, bits about this place that had made me fall in love with Cavell, and um, maybe something, a festive occasion, a celebration, or the quirky neighbors that I was surrounded by and who I had until then not been able to appreciate. And all of that found its way, all those vignettes and those moments found its way into the book. And I think that was more about an exploration, about finally finding home. And Bombay Balchao kind of stemmed from that understanding that, yes, I'd finally found where I belonged.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Sankar, welcome back. Sorry, we lost you in the middle of that, description of home and the really powerful thing. So if you want to just sort of complete that thought,
Sure.
because I think
Sorry
I
about
have
my
something very interesting to ask you next.
my home connection was a little unstable. No, I was just going to finish up by saying is that I that phase of Calcutta, that 80s Calcutta, I think those of us who grow up, and yet writing about the past is not about nostalgia, because it was hardly a nostalgic phase. It was actually a very depressing time. Any of us who grew up in Calcutta in the 80s before liberalization will remember the load sheddings, the traffic jam, and all of that. And there's a strange sense of, I might say, guilt. I wonder if Manjali, I wonder how she feels about this. Those of us who left Calcutta, and I mean, obviously, someone like me, and I thought I left the city, but clearly, when I was living and I did my MFA in the US and I was sitting in the US and writing, I was writing only about Calcutta. Clearly, you can take a guy out of Calcutta, but not Calcutta out of the guy. So there's this sense. But yet, there's this bizarre thing that very depressing, bureaucratic, decadent reality was strangely artistically magnetic. And I've written about this, that the situation which frustrates the modern citizen actually enthralls the modern artist. What it is like to be caught in a traffic jam, what it is like to be in a bus and stuck there. And in my early stories, there's so many stories about being caught there. What is so magnetic about this situation you hate? So in many ways, I think for me, this Calcutta obviously has been an important. I think in my new work, I'm moving beyond, and I've written, and there's a reason why I haven't written much about the US for a long time. I think in many ways, I write through memory. It's very hard for me to write about the room I'm living in, but the moment I step out of the room, my editing thing comes into play. I start thinking, and memory is a wonderful editor. I was just talking to my son, who's 7, and he was just telling me that, see, I have the weirdest memories about things. I said, That's what memory is like. You don't remember the important things. You remember some stain on somebody's cloth. You don't remember something important somebody was saying. You remember the way there was a fly behind their ear while you remember, and this is how art comes into being. You remember the weird things, and that's how why writing through memory is so important. So I started writing about the US after leaving 3 years after leaving that place. So memory is a kind of a wonderful editor. It tells you what's important, often by pointing to the most obviously unimportant things. So in many ways, I think what for me was that Calcutta was not just a place but also a phase of life where my relationship with reality was very vulnerable, very raw, very brutal, where there were these unknown fears and pleasures which I didn't make sense of. And that is something I've carried on. And it is not the romance, it was never the romance of that diasporic writer. I'm now back in India, I'm not diasporic. It was always a sense of a phase of life where you're exposed to forces which you don't understand. And it also happened to be a very maddening, infuriating, but beautiful place that was Calcutta.
Amazing. So for a person, I mean, I've always grown up and lived in the South, and Calcutta and for that matter Bombay are two cities that have been written about so much in Indian writing that there's almost a picture that I carried in my head of these cities, purely from what I had read about. And when you talked about that, uh, you know Calcutta and Bombay, the beautiful muses of many Indian stories, but we've all been fortunate to have been exposed to such wonderful atmospheres, settings that just live on forever. From R.K. Narayan's Malgudi, and then I won't even get out of Indian fiction, right? I'm just going to stick to Indian fiction, Indian writing. From R.K. Narayan's Malgudi to even an Amish Meluha, just these wonderful settings that have been created. I could see Malgudi even before it came on Doordarshan, because we had such a wonderful, powerful picture that the man had painted for us. Maybe we just kind of break away from your writing and talk about some of these uh, beautiful things that you've read, that's inspired you, that's stayed with you even as you've continued your journey. Jane, why don't we start with you?
Well, for me, Subodh, I think it would be Kiran Nagarkar's Ravan and Eddie series. Um, I don't know how many of you have read that book, but the first book, for instance, talks about the Bombay chawls, a chawl in Masgao in Mumbai. And it's while it's about these two characters, it's also about the neighbors and the life of people who live in chawls. And chawls are such an important and distinct part of the city. Uh, you don't see them anymore like they used to exist, but that just opened another world for me. I was so amused by Bombay Balchaw even talks about water problems. So does something like Ravan and Eddy. But the water problems that say a neighborhood like Wells had and one that a chawl would have are so distinctly different, and that was so amusing. So he just drew me into that world with that particular series, Ravan and Eddy, because eventually the characters go, they I think they become rich, they manage to buy sprawling homes in skyscrapers. So this movement from humble beginnings to finally making a name for yourself and making it through this city, that was quite a liberating read for me. And he just managed to make me laugh with his stories. So for me, it was Ravan and Kiran Nagarkar's Ravan and Eddie series, and also Rohinton Mystery. I read his novel Such a Long Journey when I was doing my literature. I was doing my master's in literature, and such a beautiful novel. It talks about this couple living in this really old building, and he even makes the most mundane and inane routine life experiences. He just makes you imagine what it would be like. So I think that would be a perfect example for me, atmospheric fiction. Growing up, I think definitely it was Malgudi and Ruskin Bond's novels. His Masuri
Oh, yeah.
setting, most haunting, and has always wanted me to go. I've always visualized myself being in Masuri and experiencing the same things that probably Ruskin Bond did.
Himanjali, how about some of your sort of beautiful memories?
Favorite atmospheric
Yeah.
fictions. Well, the first books that come to mind, I'm not going to stick to Indian authors because I think all of us grew up reading so much of English literature, especially, and then you do your undergrad in literature, which I think some of us have. So then the first book actually that came to my mind was Dracula somehow, Bram Stoker,
Wow.
and because just that there, like I think Saikat said about how atmosphere can almost be a character, and it's just like the way he's describing those, is it what was it, Transylvania? No,
Transylvania.
I'm very, yeah. So all those dark, brooding, massive mountains and the Dracula's castle, and it's just like that. It just stays with you. So, like, of course, Dracula, the vampire fiction has been completely messed up after that. I mean, in recent years, but that original Dracula is
You have
something
Instagram vampires now. It's all about Instagram vampires now.
Yeah, so things like that. And even the other novel I was thinking of is Wuthering Heights, which is again also very that the atmosphere is such a part is kind of almost coming alive, those dark moors and all of that. So there's a magnificent building up of atmosphere, which I think is you don't always find. And of course, as I said, we've grown up reading English literature, so even as a child, I was like yearning for what should I say? But when you're reading Dickens and you know London so well because just of the way he creates that, sort of recreates that world for you, or even romantic poetry. If you think of it, like of course now again we like to mock the daffodils and stuff like that, but the fact is that sensory quality that was there in romantic poetry, like Keats' Ode to Autumn. I mean, the kind of rich imagery and all of that. I think that fed a lot into my idea of how to really create atmosphere. And if you're, is my connection bad? I mean, can you all hear me?
No,
Because
I can hear you well.
Oh, okay. Okay. There's a message. So, and of course, if you're talking about, in fact, I'm not talking about my writing here, but my co-panelist's writing, because I'm in the middle of Jane's book, actually. I'm halfway through Bombay Balchao, and I'm quite envious of the way it sort of constructed that world, because the sentences are like long but compact, and even it's like what he's talking about, one street and the lives in that neighborhood, but so she might just be describing say a garden in front of an apartment, but it's done in a way that's so like when describing all the plants, it's all very pitch perfect, I would say. And also Saikat, who of course I've edited also, but the way he does the detailing, the kind of gets like that what he himself said about the sensoriness of his writing, and so with little words, so that you really feel that place. So yeah, I think I'm envious of writers who are able to do that. I'm not, yeah.
And yeah, I mean, now that we've jumped away from my Indian fiction, the first time I ever ate scones, I was so disappointed. Famous Five and Secret 7 made it sound so delicious. It tasted like a dried bun.
Exactly. Yeah, that
I
kind of
was
thing.
23 and thoroughly disappointed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right?
Jamaica King once said that
Saikat, jumping on to you.
she once said that I grew up talking about how sensory strawberries are, how beautiful strawberries are, without having eaten a single one. And I describe my own vegetation, palm trees, and sea beaches as exotic when they're all around me. Because the sense of what is mine and what is exotic, I was taking from English literature. So that's a reality we all know. You know, the irony.
Absolutely. Second, do you want to talk about something that you loved
Sure.
that stayed with you?
Sure. Actually, I just recently wrote about one book in a book column I write. I don't know, Jane, know this book. It's a book called Vertigo by Ashok Banker. It's a Bombay book, and it came out in the early 90s. It talks about Bombay in 1983, and it's quite an unforgettable book for a number of reasons, um, um, because it's actually a popular novel, but before a time when Chetan Bhagat and Amish, obviously, they made this genre understandable. So I don't think it did very well. People, I think India at the time was not ready to kind of understand what this kind of books are about. I mean, Shobha Dev was obviously writing, but she was the only one. And it evokes this pre-liberalization Bombay in a kind of an unforgettable way, and it ends with the day Indira Gandhi was shot in 1984, and the kind of calm that's or the kind of eerie calm that falls all over the city. It's about this young, it's a very Bombay story, young uh, Gujarati, actually boy born of a failed marriage between a Gujarati man, a businessman, and a Goan Catholic, whom is a very Bombay family. But it's really quite amazing story. But one thing I want to say is that I think Indian English fiction has just obviously gone beyond metro cities as well, and this going right back to one of my early favorites. Subodh obviously has mentioned Malgudi, which we all know. But I was also thinking of a book by Raja Rao on the Ganga Ghat, where Rao writes about Benares beautifully, and it's a Benares where he brings. Rao had an interest in mysticism and spiritualism. He brings it in, but he has an incredibly light touch. So I mean, I think Benares is one of the most incredibly magnetic cities. In India, I remember the first time I saw the prayer on the Ghats of Benares. And having grown up in a city in a very secular Anglophone atmosphere, it was a revelation to me that, oh my God, the power of this. And obviously, that was long before that power took on very disturbing overtones. Obviously, it was a kind of a presaging of what might happen to India. But even I remember this was in the early 2000s or late 90s. And so these are some of the most interesting things I think in 21st century we've seen, the sort of so-called smaller towns, the provincial locations that have come about. I mean, writers like Tabish Khair, who've written beautifully about it. And actually, there's a very interesting collection that just came out, writing and the city where I also contributed. And Tabish wrote about Gaya. Then there are some Anjum Hassan wrote about Bangalore, but also about the Northeast. So I think physical locations have actually been quite amazing. One of another favorite of mine is Anita Desai's In Custody, where I, again, having lived in Bombay for Delhi for a few years, and yet I feel I'm not connected. But that evocation of old Delhi, that evocation of old Delhi, the culture of Urdu poetry, it's just amazing. So yeah, I mean, I like Subodh. I completely agree. One doesn't even need to go out of India because the reality is so colorful, so incredible, and such wide ranging. And for the longest time, Indian English writing was obviously dominated by the big cities. You're absolutely right, Bombay and Calcutta being very. But I have been very drawn to this representation of the suburbs, of the so-called peripheries, which are now quite powerful, just like in Netflix movies. Now so many of the movies are not just about Bombay or the big cities, but about small towns in Bihar and UP, and it's wonderful to see that. So yeah, it's been great.
So true. So true. Well, it's been a interesting conversation, and I just realized we have maybe about a minute left. So I thought if we could sort of quickly, I think the three of you come from three different things that you otherwise do in your daily life. Himanjali as an editor, Saikat as an academic and a literary critic, and Jane as a journalist. If you had something sort of quickly to add that people that might be interested in sort of listening, uh, can take away as tips for their own writing, for their own process, for their own things. So, from your perspective, if you have maybe something that you can say in about a minute or so, it might be interesting to people listening in about how and when they need to think about creating settings for their stories. So, Saikat,
Sure,
I'll
because
ask you to
Okay.
I was just saying he'll be the best for this because he's an actor. He teaches writing. So
I know he
yeah.
teaches writing, so but yeah.
Hot seat, but I think teaching of writing is a very paradoxical thing. I mean, I'll just say that, obviously, I mean, Aristotle says that, the character is what matters in fiction, because story is simply what the character does. Character is what matters. And he also says that character is a verb. Character is action. Character is not just describing somebody's the color of their dress, but what they do. So this is, I think, and I add to that is that character in a place, it's a verb in a place in all its fullness. And I'd say that, I mean, I think I'd say to aspiring writers that have a really meaningful relationship with the place you write about. And I think a lot of young writers I see these days are writing about the alternative world. I think obviously Himanjali knows about this herself. I think she creates characters quite magnetically. But as opposed to those of us who seem to be kind of stuck in places, I think obviously very important. But I think a lot of young writers are taking, I mean, like writers in their teens and early 20s, they are kind of writing about the alternative and the speculative, and that's absolutely wonderful. That's really great. But sometimes I tell them that you live in Indian cities. Look outside your window. Look what's out there, because overwhelmingly, and of course over this last 1 year when we haven't gone out much, our life is completely taken up by the screen. I think there's this whole absorption into Netflix that is creating this alternative world, which I think can be wonderful. But I would say that you're missing out a bit. Look outside of the street, see the epic of the Indian street. Look it out there, and try to create it. And character is, comes fully alive when they belong to a place. As Jane's work and my work, especially, we write about characters which are very much from a certain culture. I'm a huge fan of that. And remember, alternative worlds actually create great world building. Think of Tolkien or Harry Potter, the immense amount of world building one has to do. So if you're ready to do that, yes. But on the other hand, you have ready worlds that you can write about. So yeah, either way, the sensory reality of the world is very important for characters.
Himanjali.
Yeah, I don't really have anything much to add. Just that I feel there's no like what we're saying is that you have to keep reading. And I think that's the advice I can give, because that's the only thing I've done all my life is just read a lot, and I don't have a great memory, so I don't really like if you ask me for exactly what I was doing, what I read yesterday, I can't. I'm not good with remembering details, but I also feel that whatever I've read, it must be there somewhere inside me, and it must be sort of going kind of influencing all that I do, all that I write. And so I feel, and books have played a really important. It's been an important character in my life. I don't think my life has been fairly mundane, I would honestly say. So the excitement I get is more from other lives, which come through literature. And I think there's no substitute for that. Especially when you want to be a writer, you just have to read a lot.
Absolutely. And if you don't remember, it gives you a chance to read that book all over again. Jane, let's conclude today's conversation with something from you.
I would say be authentic. As a writer of my first debut book, I think it came from such a familiar space, and maybe because I'm a journalist, I would say this: when you write about something, be aware of that experience before you put it down on paper. Feel that experience. Don't write about things that you're not too sure about or you've not experienced yourself. It's good to imagine, but imagination should also be authentic so that somebody else can identify with it. So I would say stay authentic when you're writing.
Fabulous. So with that, I think we've reached our given time limit. It's been a wonderful, wonderful opportunity for me to, meet Himanjali and Saikat once again, albeit virtually, and Jane, meet you for the first time. And I hope, people that have been listening to you have gotten a sense of, your work, how you write, some of your inspirations. And thank you all very much. I've had a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Bye bye.
Thanks. Bye
Bye.
bye.
See you.
Bye bye.